So now that we've looked at some basic polygon modeling tools and techniques, I just want to talk about how you should approach modeling. Just a few tips, really. Now, we're in the middle of this sort of endless digital 3D environment, and you could model anywhere you wanted. You could create a cube, start scaling it up, and, going to mesh and smoothing it, and then tweaking it and doing different things. But it makes a lot more sense to model in the middle of the world. So if we turn on the grid in our perspective view, you'll see that this is the middle of our digital 3D environment where these two thick lines cross. That's the 0, 0, 0 point in X, Y, and Z. And the reason you want to model here is that it affords many benefits of working symmetrically over these lines. It allows you to work to scale. So when you're creating models for an animation, it's likely you'll create individual models in individual scenes or Maya files and then bring them together in another file for animation. And so in addition to working in the middle of the world, you want to work to scale. So this grid is 24 units wide and deep, and you want to take that into consideration. So if I wanted to model this guy's hat, well, I would actually probably do it in, I might do it in this scene, but if I wanted to model something to fit to his head in another scene, I would take note of the scale that I'm working at and try and work to the same scale. Another thing to consider when you're modeling is to try to be precise, at least in the beginning, before you go a little more free-form to create small details. And so that's maybe best seen when we look at, if I just hide this guy, and his eyeballs. If we want to, let's say, create a curve. So if I go to create curve tools, CV curve tool, I can just click and hit return, and I make a curve. However, if I want to be a little more precise about it, and I'll go to that same curve tool, I can just change my background color a little bit. I can hold down X and it will snap to these grid points. So if I wanted to be a little bit more precise about the spacing of things, then I can use that kind of snapping to do that. So snapping is actually quite important. If I had another object in the scene and I wanted to snap to a vertex, let's say I create another cube and I'm moving it around, if I hold down V and middle mouse drag, it's going to snap to the nearest vertex. So if I hold down V, middle mouse click and drag, it's going to pop to that vertex. If I want to put this thing on the curve, if I hold down C, middle mouse drag onto the curve, it's going to snap to the curve. Now it's not locked to the curve in any way, but it is a good way to place things precisely. So let me just show you that again. Now, a couple things that can happen with snapping is that it depends on which axis you have activated. Right now I've just got the middle activated, so if I do hold down C and then middle mouse click, so remember middle mouse click to activate the snapping, it will pop there. If I click on one axis, you can see it's highlighted in yellow, and if I do the same thing, hold down C, middle mouse click onto the curve, it's going to try and pop over to the curve, but only by moving in that one activated axis. And that can be a bit of a frustrating part of snapping. Kind of forget to do that and it will not pop where you want it. So to activate the middle, so all axes, you just click on the square in the middle, and then we can do that here. So another thing to consider when you are doing your model is where the pivot point of your object is. So right now if I select this cube, the pivot point is in the middle, and if I want to snap it to the middle of the world, I can do that. Holding down X, middle mouse, dragging over the grid intersection where I want it to snap. But let's say I wanted the bottom of the object to snap there, or I just want to be able to rotate it about this part of the model. To change the position of the pivot, you hit D on the keyboard, and then you're free to move the gimbal around, or the manipulator handles. It's not moving the object, now it's just moving where the pivot is. And so if I hit D again, then I'm out of that mode, and then now when I manipulate this object, that's the point about which it will rotate. And if I snap somewhere, it's that point that's snapping. So no matter what shape your object is, it's going to have a single pivot point where your manipulator handles are, and that can be quite important for how things will snap together. It will become more important later on when we use objects for instancing. That means duplicating it many times to attach to particles or as part of a mesh network. So you have to learn to control your pivot point. Another thing to consider when you're modeling is trying to keep clean topology. Now, what does that mean? It's a bit of a difficult term to describe. So let me show this again. So here's my head model. So you can see I've got fairly clean flow, pretty evenly distributed polygons. Now I've got these two that are kind of bunched up here, but it's to add a little bit of detail going along here. So when you are working on a model, it's often advised to work in quads to keep your polygons four-sided as much as possible. And it's not a rule that you have to slavishly adhere to. However, it is a good practice, especially in the early stages of modeling. I can see I've got a bunch of triangles down here. When I merge these vertices together, it looks like it caused a problem. Actually, this is not a triangle. It's got 1, 2, 3, 4 sides. It just looks like a triangle. These two are triangles in the middle. So one of the reasons you want to try and keep four-sided polygons flowing cleanly around the geometry is that you can add edge loops into your geometry easily. So shortcut for that, with your object selected, Shift right mouse click, go to Insert Edgeloop Tool. And so you can see now I've got one going from the corner of the eye all the way down the neck, because I've got a clean flow of topology going that way. Now, when I modeled the mouth here, I modeled in rings around the lips, so if I needed to add more detail, I can insert an edge loop and it will go all the way around. When you have triangles in your mesh, if I try and insert an edge loop here, oh, I guess that's not a triangle, because it does go all the way around. But if I did have a triangle, so I'll make a triangle. Let's get my multi-cut tool, and let's say I cut this polygon in half. Now I've got two triangles here, and if I go into object mode, right click, Shift, Insert Edge Loop Tool, you can see when I try and insert an edge loop now, it's going to stop at this triangle because it doesn't know whether to continue on this way or to continue on that way. You can see I've got another triangle here around the ear where I was trying to attach a complex object into a lower res face. So this is not a failure of the model, but it makes it a little less clean. And when you've got polygons, now this is a 5-sided polygon here, 1, 2, 3, oh sorry, this is actually a 4-sided polygon now that I've divided it. It was a triangle before. But sometimes when you smooth it, you run into some problems with pinching. Now we're not really seeing it here, but you get sort of less clean looking geometry here. Again, eventually you have to stray from this to add small detail, but to keep your topology flowing smoothly in the early stages is important. The other thing to think about is when you're modeling, think about what your model has to do. Does it have to be able to deform, or is it just a static hard surface model? And if it's a deformable object, then you want the topology to flow in such a way to allow those deformations. So here in the face, I do want this to deform to make different facial expressions. So I have this following the actual musculature of the face. So when I make him smile, this is not going to work that well. But the model will deform in a natural way. So if it's an arm that you're creating, let's say, and we go here. If I want this to deform in the middle, it has to have subdivisions here. So if this is the elbow, I can actually add subdivisions at the beginning, or I can go and insert edge loops in the area where I'm going to want deformation. So you need to add topology to allow it to do what you want it to do. And the final thing I'll say is that as you work, delete the history on your objects when you no longer need the construction history. So this object has some history now, poly split ring, that's the insert edge loop, poly split ring, and there's the poly mirror. But if I don't need to go back in and change any of the settings for these, as you work, go to Edit, Delete by Type, History to get rid of that. History can be useful sometimes to animate an object or to go back and change certain settings, but most of the time it's best to get rid of it as you go along. And for your final model for animating, you definitely want to get rid of all the non-essential history. And the last thing you should do when you're working on a model is to name it intelligently. Otherwise, you'll get a big outliner filled with polyspheres, cubes, curves, extruded objects, and so on, and things will quickly become a disorganized nightmare. So work clean, work smart, work in the middle of the world.